Hello everybody. Thank you, Nicholas, for setting all this up. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to give a little bit of a history lesson about the Artemis Society and the days before the Moon Society came along. I was around since almost the beginning, not quite. So I'll go back as far as I can and fill in the blanks with other information there as well. Basically, a little bit about myself. I've been involved in space advocacy from early my childhood. I joined the L5 Society back in the 1970s, early 1970s, and was actually present in Pittsburgh when the L5 Society merged with the National Space Institute to form the National Space Society. So that was a rather momentous event. Um, Other duties, I've been very involved with the National Space Society as a database consultant, also on the NSS Internet Services Committee. Of course, as you'll hear in a little bit, I was a director of Artemis Society and also one of the founding directors and chairman of the board of the Moon Society, and also served as vice president in 2000 and 2001. I was also a director of the Lunar Resources Company and also served as director of the Mars Foundation and the Mars Institute of Massachusetts, roles that I still hold at this time. So I've been around as a volunteer in the space community for much longer than I want to think about at this point. But in any case, I've been around for a lot of the main activities of the Artemis Project and the Artemis Society, and that will be the focus of my presentation today. So where did it all start? Well, I think the best explanation of all that was given by Greg Bennett, who you'll be hearing a lot more about in a little while. Later in the life of the Artemis Society, we had one of our open forum meetings on IRC, which I'll go into more details later, but he opened up one of the meetings in 1999 with a little bit of a history lesson, and I feel that best summarizes where it all started. And I described this as, in the beginning, there was a genie. The genie was a GE service that was actually founded in 1985. It was launched as a ASCII text-based service competing against CompuServe. Those of you who have been around for a while may remember that. Back in the day, it was an online service created by General Electric, their GE Information Services division, and it ran through the end of 1999, but it wasn't very active in the end because obviously the internet took over and mostly supplanted it. But early on, so I actually worked at GE, started in the early 1980s as a summer intern and ended up as a project manager in 1990. And that was a little before this story truly begins. As a GE employee, I had free access to Genie and a lot of information about it. So I was very active in the Genie communities and ended up stumbling across a group called the Experimental Spacecraft Society that was started in October 1990. I joined them somewhere in 91, thereabouts. My records are a little bit fuzzy in that area. But they had a forum in the Space and Science Roundtable on Genie called the Experimental Spacecraft Society Online. And since I was heavily involved in electronic communications and communications technologies at the time, they wanted to have a presence on the internet, which they really didn't have. They only had the Genie board. So I set up an electronic mailing list on Genie and on the internet for the Experimental Spacecraft Society and built a portal, a gateway between Genie and that mailing list to be able to distribute electronic communications to people outside of Genie. And all of this history is relevant because it ties into how I first got involved with the Artemis Society. So as Greg described in 1999, he mentioned the best date he could think of when the Artemis Project was founded. It was a little bit fuzzy in everybody's mind. But sometime in January of 1994, he posted a now infamous note in his author topic on Genie. As a science fiction author at the time, he had his own forum channel in Genie. And he posted the question, anybody want to talk about a commercial moon base? So if there's anything that rests as the founding moment of all of this, it was that moment when he posted that simple message on Genie. He had been working on concepts for the Artemis project ever since. He first founded a local chapter of the L5 Society in 1976. So he'd been tossing these ideas around for quite some time, but this was the first time he mentioned it on a wider audience. And he describes the purpose of the Artemis project in very simple terms. We are going to establish a permanent self-supporting community on the moon. Nothing else that we could do in our lifetimes would be more important to the development of space and the expansion of mankind into the cosmos. So that really puts everything into perspective. And that was the very start of this effort. So they ended up forming, well, first, this actually was, again, before my time by a little bit. So some of this information came from the excellent Moon Society primer that James Burke put together in 2018. And he describes the early days where in March of 1994, Greg and another space advocate by the name of Marianne Dyson, we've worked for NASA in Houston as well, presented the Artemis project at NorwestCon, one of the science fiction conventions, and then had their own conference later that year in Irvine, California, to start putting together the concepts of the Artemis project and forming the idea of Artemis Society International itself. Again, I was not around at that time, but I heard from Greg and others afterwards. The most notorious element of that conference when they organized the Artemis Society was trying to figure out who was going to be chairman of the board. Again, there were 4 people that were nominated to be on the board: Greg Bennett, Dana Carson, Ian Strock, and Boise Pearson. Well, the apocryphal tale that's been passed around for decades now, no idea how true it is, but everybody swears it was true, is that when Boise Pearson stepped out of the room to go to the bathroom, everybody looked at each other and nominated him to be chairman of the board and president. And they all voted, and the decision was made before he even returned to the room. So he was drafted and turned into the first chairman of the board and president without his knowledge. So it's a little bit of a tidbit about the very start of that. And the Artemis Society International itself was formally incorporated in Alabama, which is where Boise lived at the time, in early 1995. So a little bit, a number of months later. So during 1994, it started to expand from the authors category that Greg had on Genie into its own category in the Science Fiction Roundtable Forum. And they also set up a separate internet mailing list called Artemis List at lunacity.com. And also at the time when Dana Carson was the webmaster, he set up an initial website for the Artemis project on his own personal web server. This is a slightly later version. I was unable to find a snapshot of the original 1994 vintage website, but this was actually from 1997, the earliest snapshot available at the site in the Internet Archive. But it really didn't change much in the first couple of years, so I think this is pretty close to what it used to be. And the discussions on Genie quickly grew, got into a lot of different subcategories. And then by late 1994, I had stumbled across those categories, started to pay attention to what this thing called the Artemis Project was, and really got fascinated about it. So I decided I wanted to be a member. So in November of 1994, I joined Artemis Society International. And as soon as I filled out the application form, I got an email from Greg Bennett. And this is an excerpt of that infamous email, which started the ball rolling in a lot of interesting ways. First of all, it was just acknowledgement, thanking me for being a member. And the poster he's referring to at that time was a much smaller, I think it was a 8.5 by 11 poster. Obviously, the poster that we talked about a little while ago, which I'll be going in more detail, was a much bigger effort later on that decade. But in any case, he welcomed me to the Artemis Society, and apparently he stumbled across the fact that I was sending it from a GE Information Services email address. So he ended the email with, "I'm really curious about your email address. Is that General Electric and Information Services, as in the same folks who bring us Genie?" And of course it was. And of course that's where I first heard about the Artemis Society, or the Artemis Project. So I mentioned that I had been active in Genie in the Experimental Spacecraft Society, and that's where I learned about ASI. And I also mentioned that I had created and set up that Genie to Internet mailing list gateway one year before for the Experimental Spacecraft Society. Well, of course, Greg jumped all over that, and a follow-up email that he sent mentioning, "So that's where I've seen your name before," was on the Genie forums, and he mentioned his activities in Genie, and I had offered to do a similar gateway for the Artemis list mailing list to Genie, and of course his reply was, "Oh boy, that sounds great," which, for those of you who know Greg, that's when he gets excited, he starts acting like a little kid sometimes. So I immediately got hard to work on setting up that gateway. And of course, the date of this email was December 3rd. By December 10th, I had the gateway implemented, and the gateway was up and running, synchronizing traffic between the Genie forum and the mailing list. And as the number of subscribers to the list continued to grow, we reached the point where a single mailing list could no longer support all of the communications needs of the organization. So by mid-1995, I had, I think, I'm kind of winging it here, so if I misremember some of the dates, they'll be corrected on the next slide. Anyway, ended up, we had started creating in mid-1995 the Artemis technical committees. They were kind of breakout groups to organize all the different technical activities that were going on. And the technical committees provided the perfect forum to improve the electronic communications infrastructure of the Artemis project. So in December of 1995, December 4th to be exact, I formed the Electronic Communication Technical Committee. And the names there are the original committee members. I was the chairperson of the committee, along with Nancy Braskett, Dana Carson, Nick Gravian, David Brummel, Steve Jackson, who was the head of IO Games at the time, Dale Amon, who's been around forever, and Michael Wallace. We sketched out this architecture for synchronizing all the different electronic communications of the Artemis project across lots of different forums, from web pages to Usenet news groups, bulletin board systems, various online services, not only Genie, as well as FTP mail and web server interfaces. Excuse me. And the idea was to automatically synchronize all of these mechanisms so that any posts made in one forum will automatically be replicated in all of the others, so that people can use whatever communications medium they are most comfortable with. They would also provide automatic archives of all of those communications in the appropriate place. And the plan was that each separate Artemis technical committee, and there were dozens of them, would have their own separate individual communications areas, such as a separate mailing list, news group, etc., to share, and as well as a common area, such as existing Artemis list mailing lists. So we ended up spinning up lots and lots of different communications vehicles and different interfaces for each of those areas. Then one of the first conferences that I got involved in was the next year, the infamous now Artemis 96 conference, which was in June in Houston, Texas. And the quote on the left is the announcement of the conference. We reserve space at the Nassau Bay Hilton across from the Johnson Space Center on NASA Road 1 for the weekend of June 28th. But just before the start of the conference, we received news that the BBC was sending a film crew to the conference to tape a segment for an episode of an upcoming series that would air in the United Kingdom, and it later aired in the US on the Discovery Channel. And this picture, which I only found recently, is a behind-the-scenes photo that was taken of the field out in front of the hotel where we all gathered to be filmed by the BBC film crew. Obviously, the cameraman there on the left. And one of the things you'll notice in this photo, which will be relevant when you see the actual video segment, is the sun was incredibly bright in Houston that day. So much so that everybody was squinting. The cameraman kept saying, look at the camera, which of course was right into the sun. So a lot of us were sitting there with tears running down our face because the sun was so bright. So keep that in mind when you see the video segment. So of course, many of you have probably seen this already, but this is kind of the highlight of my presentation. This was the video segment that ended up airing on August 23rd of 1996 in the Future Fantastic series, and the title of that episode was Underneath a Purple Sky. So let me try it here.
Getting into space takes 9 minutes. A journey to the moon takes 3 days.
Can everybody hear it okay?
230,000 miles away, our return to the moon will be the first stage of our interplanetary odyssey.
Good.
And it might not be governments or big business that takes us there. Lunar renegades, space enthusiasts, aerospace workers, and science fiction fans, known collectively as the Artemis Society. Brought together by the internet, they're one of several groups drawing up ambitious plans for the first permanent base on the moon. Artemis founder Greg Bennett manages McDonnell Douglas's spacewalk team.
Our job is like that of the pilgrims. To go there, stay, build a community, and build an environment where people can live. Build houses and hotels and farms and things. If everything goes well, we could probably land our exploration base in about 8 years. Maybe 10 years after that, we would have built to the point where we're actually doing tourist flights.
Ordinary people getting to the moon? It's an idea that's as fanciful as any in science fiction. But that early tradition of backyard spacemen going it alone may yet prove accurate. Certainly NASA isn't looking down its nose at these new pioneers.
Ultimately, people, individuals, and groups with their own individual agendas will be the motivation for exploration in space. Remember that the early explorations of the American West consisted of outposts, even individuals doing exploration. And probably in another 20 years, they will have access to the technologies for the transportation into space.
When the Apollo crews first saw the Earth rising over the surface of the moon, they were just awed. And we can provide an opportunity for anyone to see that same spectacle and witness the Earth floating in space. My own fantasy for developing the moon is to make it analogous to someplace like Hawaii, a vacation paradise.
June 1996. The Artemis Society draw up a business plan for the conquest of the moon. Their ambition is to raise the money by selling the movie rights. The technology needed to build a moon base has been around for years, but it doesn't come cheap. Total cost of mission, $1.4 billion.
I think that the people who advocate movement into space are beginning to understand the need for a good business plan in order to accomplish their goals. The Artemis project is doing these kinds of steps. But they will succeed when they have access to the kinds of resources to begin to carry out their plans and their ambitions.
Moon bases won't just be the pleasure domes of the future. The moon will become a cosmic frontier town with mines, factories, and power stations. It will be an interplanetary staging post for the pioneers who wave the Earth goodbye.
The moon as a floating gold mine. It's not a new idea. In a remarkable piece of fictional fortune-telling, the 1933 story Brigands of the Moon predicted a rich seam of radioactivity that could be mined for fuel. 50 years later, studies revealed that deep within moon rock is a substance called helium-3. widely expected to be the fusion fuel of the next century. It's just one of the treasures awaiting the first lunar prospectus.
Once we get up there, then we start mining the moon. And we pull the oxygen out to use for rocket fuel. We pull the metals out to build spaceships. We'll also bring some chunks of the moon home because there's quite an economic value to just moon rocks. Moon rocks are neat and pretty, and you can't get them on Earth.
Right now we think of the moon as a raw materials base. Maybe that's too narrow. Maybe polluting industries will be based on the moon. Maybe the moon will be a manufacturing center for supplying materials and electronics and solar cells and so on to other kinds of space activities.
But there could be a more pressing reason for going back to the moon.
So they cut off a little bit at the end, but it says our survival. And that leads on into the next segment of that broadcast, which does not feature the Artemis Society. So, oops, I don't know why I had two slides on that. Here we go. So shortly after that, in fact, in preparation for the broadcast of that episode, we had our first worldwide IRC conference. And that was on August 23rd, just for the date of the broadcast, to be able to talk about the upcoming broadcast and also have real-time communications with everybody who was unable to attend one of those conferences. And at this point, there started to be a lot of different things happening at one time, so I'm not going to necessarily go in, it won't be fully in chronological order, but I'll just touch on some of the things. Around that same time, just after the conference, one of the things talked about at the conference is we need a poster. We need a big poster, not this little one-page or 8.5 by 11 drawing. So we launched the Artemis Reference Mission Poster Project. The original poster plan, project plan was developed in July of 1996, and we worked for the next year and a half to organize the project and figure out how to pay for it, figure out how to market it, and to figure out how to design the poster. And here you'll see some of the preliminary designs that you may have never seen before, showing some of the different ideas that were put together. Obviously, the left one is a very crude starting point for it, and the right one is getting close to, for those of you who have the poster, and I think most of you do, to what the final product ended up being. That final design ended up being finished in April of 1998, specifically April 5th was when the design was officially approved by everybody on the poster project team, and I was the project manager of that poster project team. Then it went to the printers, and the very first printed poster was delivered at the end of that month, April 30th, 1998, and of course the final version is what is on the right side of your screen. That was produced and is now, I believe, still being distributed to all Moon Society members. I'm actually curious, after I'm done here, if anybody has any information as to who now handles the posters and where they're stored, because that was always a fun part of figuring out how to store boxes and boxes and boxes of these things. In any case, there was a lot of different conferences. You heard in the beginning about some of the initial conferences that we were at. Throughout the remainder of the 1990s, we managed to hit a lot of different conferences. 1999 was an incredibly busy year. There were several others that I was not a part of, including the World Science Fiction Convention, the American Mensa National Gathering. But these are the conferences that I was physically at and the ones that I presented at. I gave a presentation on the Artemis project in Milwaukee in May of 1998. That was also noteworthy because it was the first broadcast that we made from the conference using a webcam and IRC communications. So for everybody who was not able to attend the conference in person, they were able to see snapshots of the presentations. The webcam, I believe, took a picture every 30 seconds or something like that. And the IRC channel allowed conversation back and forth. So of course, this was well before the days of Zoom and online conferences. But we were starting that effort using open source and homegrown tools way back in 1998. The next spring, I gave a local presentation in Baltimore, Maryland at the Balticon 33 conference. And then again, a month later, ISDC 1999, we had a table at the conference showing our merchandise and information about the Artemis project. And Greg and Dale Amon were on panels at that conference. And then later in July of that year, we were present at the Commercial Lunar-Based Development Symposium. I also gave a presentation on the Artemis Society. And we expanded our broadcast into a live audio broadcast. We did our first streaming audio broadcast from that conference, as well as the webcast. So people were actually able to listen in to the conference remotely, which was a first for us. And that led to the next momentous conference was that fall. Artemis 99 was an Artemis-specific conference that was hosted in Las Vegas, Nevada. Greg was relocated to Las Vegas, was working for Bigelow Aerospace by that time. So we put together that conference out there at the Hampton Inn Tropicana. And it was a momentous conference for an unusual reason, in that the first night that we were there, one of the largest earthquakes in the region hit at 2:46 in the morning, and it was the first earthquake I've ever experienced in person. Was woken up in the middle of the night with the hotel, the Hampton Inn, shaking and swaying. And I still remember looking out of the hotel room window, seeing all the dust from the desert rising up into the air as it was shaken loose. It was a 7.1 magnitude earthquake. It was very noteworthy. But it was also symbolic in that it was also representing the shaking up of the Artemis Society. We were struggling with where things were going, how to manage the focus on other things involving the moon. There was a lot of people getting involved that were not necessarily actively involved in the Artemis project itself, but were interested in other activities of the moon. So we had some very informal sidebar conversations during that conference about where we should go in the future. And about a month later, we got the inaugural email from Greg Bennett asking, what would you think of Artemis Society International making a transition to become the Moon Society? So as far as I can tell, other than the informal sidebar conversations a month ago, this is the very first time that the concept of the Moon Society was first mentioned. Of course, then he went on to say this would not mean abandoning the Artemis project, but that we already had all the basic infrastructure, and whether the Artemis Society members would want to broaden the way that we present ourselves to include everything about the moon. And that evening, the board of Artemis Society International had a teleconference to discuss that proposal and to discuss transitioning Artemis Society International into the Moon Society. And a number of months later, I guess 5 months later, in May of 2000, the formal proposal was sent out to the Artemis list mailing list, which is still the primary mailing list of the society, with the proposed reorganization of Artemis Society into the Moon Society. And we presented the bylaws. This is an excerpt from that email, identifying the Moon Society bylaws committee members, which was Greg, Tim Cadell, Dana Carson, Candace Dix, Margo Dusterhouse, Scotty Gammenthaler, Boise Pearson, myself, Ian Randall-Strock, and David Wetnight was the initial committee that was organizing the bylaws for the new Moon Society. And of course, that led to the infamous transition conference a couple of months later, the Lunar Development Conference 2000, which was held in July in Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. And again, James Burke describes it much better than I could in his Moon Society primer. And I'll just read his quote. In July 2000, in a conference center ballroom at Caesar's Palace Resort in Las Vegas, the leaders and key members of TLRC and the Artemis Society International gathered to form a new organization. We wanted to appeal to a wider mainstream audience and be more inclusive of all aspects of lunar research. During that balmy afternoon, in a comfortably air-conditioned room in a glittering city built in the wasteland of one of Earth's deserts, we met to write bylaws and begin organizing the Moon Society. And from those seeds, that led to where we are now. So that concludes my journey through the past history of Artemis Society International and how we got to the founding of the Moon Society. And I guess I've left 1 minute for questions. Let me stop sharing here. Okay. So, does anybody have any questions about the history and
A number of
No,
questions.
not many questions, Randall, but a lot of interesting memories. And I recall a few of the latter events. And the last slide you put up was also an interesting conference. I recall presenting a paper there in Vegas at Caesar's Palace, I think it was. And we may have met there too.
Yep.
Rick Tomlinson was big.
yes, yeah, Rick was there as well. So.
And
I actually was there too. I didn't present, but I attended the 2000 conference.
So
well, all of us had more hair or something like that.
oh yeah, so I definitely had a lot more hair. So,
Okay.
so now you know what led up to that conference, and that was
Yes.
that was the best. It actually I spent the last 2 months digging through all my archives and all my notes and email. I mean, it was hard going back that far, digging up all that information. But that's what I was able to piece together. There are a few other missing pieces that I was unable to find. But from that, I was able to sketch out my recollection and my participation in all those efforts. As I said, I don't really know much about what happened in 1994, other than what other people have written about it. But.
The 2000 meeting was interesting. We had a proceedings done by the Space Studies Institute.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. I still have the volume, and you know that event was interesting because Dad was with us, so we drove him over to Vegas, and he had a ball hanging around a conference. I mean, he's a UN guy. He wanted to know what a space conference would be like, and he had a good, fun time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my other personal note on the conference is my wife and daughter actually joined me there, and we drove over to Los Angeles from there, and that was my first experience driving through Death Valley. And I still remember driving through there and seeing that huge thermometer in the desert reading like 115 or 120 degrees. And of course, they tell you don't roll down the window. So of course, I had to stop and roll down the window just to feel what it was like. So that was quite.
Where is home now? Back in the East Coast?
Yeah. No, I've always lived on the East Coast. So that was
Right.
That was quite an experience there. So
Excellent.
anyway, I guess Nicholas, it's time.